But what we're going to do is we're going to instrumentalize that tailings pond using a legal category and a blockchain structure. And so since we made a film of it also, then we're going to find a way to connect the artifact of the media that we made of this to the autonomous entity itself. And we're also going to find a pathway through which the audience that sees the film can become participants, stakeholders, shareholders in that, in a way that's different than them just seeing the film and saying, oh my goodness, this is a horrible thing, I wish I could help, right? So I'm just wondering if there's a way that you can pre-build into a media artifact this possibility for it. You know, as a side note, in closing, very late last night when I was looking at this again, suddenly came to me, I wonder how architecture would situate itself in relationship to disaster as an apparatus for memory. And so I was reminded of the Vajont dam disaster in Italy in the 1960s. It was 1962 or 1963. And the church at Longarone that Michelucci built right after that disaster. And so I have a bunch of links that I can share. I actually have a gazillion set of notes here. And anyway, the Vajont dam disaster killed hundreds of people, maybe I think close to 2,000 or maybe more than 2,000, and it wiped out a whole series of villages. And Michelucci's church is a really extraordinary piece of architecture by itself. But then when you look at it as a church typology, and you see that it has, you know, this amphitheater on the roof, which articulates directly a view to the valley where the tidal wave of water came from when the dam was overtopped. It's interesting to me that the architecture acknowledges the tragedy almost as a way of like re-triggering for anyone who's there, but at the same time providing a place of sanctuary for them. Now, I mean, maybe this is very old school in terms of how we would think architecture. It's like a mise-en-scène. But it taps into a structure of feeling for the people there that, for me, when I use the term structure of feeling, then it would invoke a kind of potentially legal and cultural set of mechanisms that then an instrumentalization of your project could tap into. But you could say that just stepping out of the house is an itinerant act. So the scale of migration or nomadism is important. You know, there's that passage from Ruskin in Stones of Venice, which I quote all the time recently. And it's that idea that the Lombards were a glacier stream and they left their erratic blocks. But the Arabs were a lava stream and they warmed all of the northern air, and then the Gothic emerged out of this, you know, refinement and spiritualization of northern work under Arab influence, you know. And so in that sense, you could look at a city like Venice or Istanbul, and you could say over 1,000 years, or Rome, you see the city accumulating as a kind of accretion in the place where various flows, cultural, economic, material, energetic, viral, they all mix together. And so the city like happens where all of those things come together. And then we could return to that question from before: do we serve the city, or does the city serve us? Or does the city serve the viral and bacterial passengers that, you know, are evolving incredibly in places where cities happen? So, you know, going back to Aldo Leopold's Sand County Almanac might be interesting, but instead of looking at ecosystems and, you know, migrating geese and trees, we could actually look at cities as if we were reading cities as ecosystems. And that might be an interesting way of reframing across timescales. And then also I was wondering, you know, is a nomadic city one that moves 100 miles or 1,000 miles, and also have any cities moved quite like that in human history? Or is it just a few miles? Or is it like the expansion and contraction of Rome over 1,000 years? Is that a kind of a migration? Or is it that the city is a temporary affiliation which migrates via the data packets that the city sends out when people migrate across the planet through cultures, languages, biological changes, infections, economies? You know, so that question of exactly how the city moves is really, really interesting for me. And then in the dream city becomes fragment city. I mean, obviously there's a connection right there. And there were some very interesting questions that you brought up in one of the boards. The city outlasting the regime that built it. That's the idea that someone builds a cathedral, but then the cathedral gets turned into a dance space, or a brothel, or a school. So clearly the form-function relationship in relationship to architecture or cities is flexible. And we could look at Chumi's work obviously immediately in terms of cross-programming and trans and dis-programming to try to understand what the outcome would be if we cross-program or trans-program something. Obviously Chumi's work is interested in cross-programming and trans-programming to provoke and create a kind of a transhistoric awareness. What are we doing when we build a city? We guarantee a kind of meta-stability. So the city's there, the belief systems of people in the city might change, cultures might change, but the city's still there. It's still providing some affordances as a kind of an underlying platform. But what if you said, forget the buildings or the city as fragments. You designed a legal system or a culture or a language to do what you hope the fragments of a building or the fragments of a city would accomplish. To say the city is a superorganism, and human populations form superorganisms, and therefore if we look at less solid cities, or we look for less solid cities, the way that we determine that it's a city or a migratory city is, can we classify it as a superorganism, and over what time period? And certainly a pilgrimage or the Kumbh Mela festival, etc. Those are superorganisms. They're just they're superorganisms on two levels. One, you get a festival like that with over 1 million people for a week. It's a superorganism. And then it's a distributed superorganism as everyone goes back to where they came from. Unfortunately, during global pandemics, whether it was historically, things like smallpox or the Black Death, or more recently COVID, those kinds of festivals become distributed superorganisms in a way that isn't very healthy for the people who have been at them. And they become major drivers for population shifts in the planet because of the infections they spread. So that's another superorganism at a different scale. But then you could look at them as superorganisms across a century. If a festival like that persists for a century, then the facets of it that you would classify as superorganismic are different than the facets you would classify as superorganismic for the week the festival is running each year. You know what I mean? So you get one superorganism across a week's time scale, another across a month's time scale, another across a 5-year time scale as infections, percolate out across the planet's biosphere, and then another across a century's time scale as the festival keeps happening, even though good things and bad things happen during the festival. You know what I mean? So I think that's a really, the point you bring up, I think that's a really interesting and viable way of assessing a different envelope on the city. Yeah.